We're going to be covering the major and minor prophets today. And I want to remind us that when I say we're covering the major and minor prophets, we're not going to be teaching you what's in the major and minor prophets per se. We will do it at a very, very high level. That's for you to get out. That's for you to read what's in the major and minor prophets. What we're doing is we're talking about a lot of background that will make it much clearer to you what it is you're reading. And it will all make much more sense, having been through the history, the geography, and various other types of background. What I did hand out to you are some handouts that will soon be on the course page. Either they are or they will soon be on the course page. What I did was I gave you 3 sheets, and the first one just shows the sequence of the kings of Israel and Judah. And it shows that the kings of Israel are a shorter list. They run out. And who remembers what happened to the northern kingdom of Israel? You remember what happened in 722 BC? They got wiped out by the Assyrians. The Assyrians. So when the Assyrians came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, they wiped them out. They deported a lot of the people, and they brought in a lot of people from other lands. So they really did do away with the civilization which was the northern kingdom of Israel. And they were actually headed south to do that to Judah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But the sequence of kings does go forward in the southern kingdom of Judah all the way up till 586 BC, and what happens then? It's the empire of Babylon ends up overrunning them. So we will talk about that much more today. But one of the things this does is not only give you a sequence of kings, but where do the prophets fit in? And so that's a very useful little diagram, so you can keep track of, if you're reading Micah, you'll realize you're reading a contemporary of Isaiah. So Micah was ministering in his prophetic ministry during the same era that Isaiah was. And what era was that? That was in Judah, to the kings of Uzziah, otherwise known as Azariah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Okay? So that's what this diagram will give to you. The next diagram is a super detailed version of the last diagram. Okay? So you got to get on your reading glasses for this one. If you download the image, it's actually a very high resolution image, so you can zoom in and read it if this one-page version is a little rough to read.
And
but
downloading that's on the class.
On the course page. Yes. So one of the things you'll see is you'll see all the kings of Israel and Judah again, and you'll see a variety of co-regencies. In other words, it wasn't the case always that one king is the sole king until they die and then his son takes over, or some military commander who stages a coup or whatever. There are a number of co-regencies where one king is still the king, but his son is coming in to be the new king. And so it's got some co-regencies there, and if you were looking very closely at the number of years and trying to reconcile all that, this does a great job at reconciling the number of years of each reign and how that works out, and how the years of the kings of Judah map to the kings of Israel and so forth. It also has what prophets were showing up at what times, ministering at what times in Israel and Judah. Over on the left-hand side, it shows where the prophets were ministering that do not have their own books. So the fact is there were a number of prophets that don't have their own books in our Old Testament, but the ministry of prophecy was something that God was working through even long before the first written prophets were recorded and collected and saved in our scriptures. Then the last page of this handout has the final 5 kings of Judah. And it gets pretty confusing because there's a lot of change of influence. There's Egypt is influential, and Assyria is influential, and Babylon's influential. And so Josiah was the king when all this happened, and his son takes over, Jehoahaz, and then his son takes over from him. So Jehoiakim takes over from him, and that's another son of Josiah, so that's his brother. And then Jehoiakim's son, so that's Josiah's grandson, takes over from him. And then when Jehoiakim is deposed, then Jehoiakim's uncle, who's another son of Josiah, becomes king. And there's a little blurb, a couple of sentences under each one to help you understand, okay, what was happening to those kings. We will talk about that today, but I just wanted to introduce to you the handouts. And now let's begin with today's lesson. Isaiah to Malachi. These are the books that we're trying to give you an introduction to. And these are the books as they're ordered and described in our Protestant or Christian Bibles. Okay? Our Christian Bibles. So we have a series of books called the Major Prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And remember that in the Hebrew Scriptures, that is the Bible that the Jews use, they don't consider Daniel and Lamentations to be one of the prophets. They consider those to be books in the writings. Okay, remember they have the 3 sections of their Bible. They have the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, the prophets, which includes all the Old Testament history books, right? It's Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Okay, those are what they call the former prophets. And we have some other, so we talked about all that in our last lesson. But then they have the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then they have what they call the 12, which is what we also call the minor prophets. And that's this Hosea, Jonah, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So these 17 books are what we're going to introduce to you today. If you are like me, let me tell you what it was like for me when I first encountered and read through the prophets. You may have had no idea what most of the references were to. All of the geographic references to geography, references to nations and cities and peoples and events. You had no idea what that was all referring to. You labored through reading the prophets, searching for inspiring parts that seemed universal and encouraging and inspiring and relevant to you. And you also hoped to find some predictions about the Messiah, and you were probably a bit disappointed because they were not very clear. That was my experience when I read the prophets the first time as a young Christian. And what we're going to do is try to address these things so that your next time reading through the prophets, you'll not be in this boat. In fact, I would try to articulate 4 different levels that you might read the prophets at. I've just made these up, but follow along and I think you'll see what I'm talking about. The first level is you have no background. You just dive in. Okay, you're an excited Christian. You got some exposure to Jesus. And you got some exposure to the letters. And you're excited about living the Christian life. And you turn back. You say, I want to read the whole Bible. And you read these prophets. You have no background. That's the experience I just described. Hopefully we'll get you past that as a result of this class. The next level you may have had is that you had basic geographic and historical background. That is, you knew that there was a divided kingdom. There had been a civil war. The Israel and Judah were separate nations. You had some idea that there was this empire of Assyria, and it came down and wiped out the northern kingdom. And then there was this other empire of Babylon that came after Assyria, and it came down and wiped out Judah. And then they took them all into exile, and then after some time there was a return from exile. So you might have had that level. And so that wasn't the level I had the first time I read through the prophets, but that was the level I've had for a number of years. Okay? And what I did was dig in to find the kind of background that would hopefully take us to the next level. The next level I describe as we understand the meaning of obedience to the Torah. We understand the role of the prophets. We understand more geographic and historical background, such as the stages of ascent and decline and alliances of Israel, Judah, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, and neighboring nations. Now, there's a 4th level, which is complete understanding of every geographic and geopolitical reference. Let me just say this is unattainable. This level is unattainable. Even the ancient rabbis who wrote the Talmud in the first 5 centuries after Christ, they speculated about all kinds of things. Now, they might have had sources that we don't have, but the fact is you're never going to understand every geographic and geopolitical reference, and that's okay. But with the content of this lesson today, hopefully you'll be able to move from the second level of reading the prophets to the third level, okay, or the first to the third. So let's talk first of all about the meaning of the Torah and the role of the prophets. During the period of the prophets, the Bible they had was in fact the Torah. They didn't have the books of the prophets as their Bible. They didn't have the books of the writings as their Bible. They had the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. That's what was their Bible. And the role of the prophets was to call the people back to obedience to the Torah. So we have to have, if we're going to understand the prophets, we're going to have some understanding, at least at a high level or a summary level, of how do we sum up what the commands of the Torah were all about. So I took these 3 angles at summing up the Torah. Number 1, and this is through the lens of Jesus, and so Christians are familiar with this lens. When Jesus was in his day discussing and debating at times with the rabbis, they often debated questions like, what's the most important commandment in the Torah? Now, that's not all the commandments. There are lots of commandments. But understanding what the most important commandment is should be pretty meaningful and should shed a lot of light, right? And the rabbis of his day debated between, is the most important thing to obey God, or is the most important thing to love God? So this was an existing debate among the rabbis of Jesus' day. And when he was confronted, what do you say, Jesus? What's the greatest commandment in the law, in the Torah? He said, the greatest commandments are these two. And this is not a quote of Jesus. These are the two laws that he quotes. The first one, Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. And then you remember Jesus was asked about the greatest commandment, and that's what he said was the greatest commandment. He said it was to love God. That was the greatest commandment. But then he said there's a second one that you didn't ask about, and I'm going to throw that in for free. There's a second one, and it's this. Well, and he was referencing Leviticus 19, verse 18. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. So he just quoted the second part of that. He said, and the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So, and then he said, with these two commandments, it sums up all the law and the prophets. So that was Jesus' perspective. And it was, perhaps it was also the prophet's perspective. But another angle is to look at the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, I've written them here. There's some prohibitions, that is, don't do this, and then there's some commandments to do things. So they were not to have other gods, they were not to have idols, they were not to misuse the name of God. They were supposed to keep the Sabbath, and they were supposed to honor their parents. They were not supposed to murder. They were not supposed to commit adultery. They were not supposed to steal and lie and covet. And if you look at these, you can sort of break them into, there are things oriented toward loving God, and there are things oriented toward loving people. And when people do this individually, it's just called righteousness. When people do this collectively as a society, either do this together or break these things together, they either have a just and righteous society or they have an unjust and an unrighteous society. And among Jewish people, commentators and rabbis, they'll speak a lot about social justice. And social justice is this doing good to one's fellow man in accordance with the commandments. It's not quite the same meaning that we have today about social justice. But social justice is this idea of a society of individuals who are kind to one another, who love one another, and who obey the commandments of goodness and decency one to another. Okay, so the Ten Commandments is another way of looking at it. Or we could just look through the prophets and boil down the themes that we see there. In fact, there are two buckets of themes that come up repeatedly in the prophets. They're either condemning the kings or the leaders in general. It might even be the priests. They're often condemning the leaders. Sometimes they're condemning the individuals in society as a whole for getting back to idolatry. And of course, the Canaanites were big into idolatry. The surrounding nations were all into idolatry. And coupled with idolatry of that time was frequently involvement with sexual immorality. Now, I'm sure there was plenty of sexual immorality going around that had nothing to do with idolatry. But the idolatry in Canaan often had temple prostitutes or shrine prostitutes. And part of the celebration or the worship of the Baals or the other gods of Canaan, the ones that they would be tempted to set up idols to, a lot of the practice had to do with sexual immorality. So that's why sexual immorality and idolatry often go together in terms of condemnation. So the prophets would often rebuke the Israelites, that is, those in Judah or those in the nation of Israel, for their idolatry or sexual immorality. They're disobeying the commandments. They clearly also disobeying the two greatest, or the greatest commandment and the other that's like it. Another thing that they would focus on, another basket of messages that the prophets would deliver, is all about justice, righteousness, and kindness, alternatively translated into English as mercy. So this notion of social justice, of being a just society, of being a collection of just individuals, of righteous individuals, this was something that the prophets would speak to the people frequently about. So these two baskets, as you go through the prophets, you'll see that these two baskets of themes are frequent, common, and regular throughout the prophets. It's also the case that when we read the Torah, that is the first 5 books of Moses, we'll see that the covenant comes with conditions. Here in Deuteronomy, which you remember where Deuteronomy was? Moses was saying goodbye to the Israelites as after they had wandered in the desert 40 years. They were about to cross the Jordan River into Canaan and take possession of the promised land. Moses was not allowed to go, so he gave them admonitions. And that is the book of Deuteronomy. So he restates the law. In fact, the word Deuteronomy means the second law. And so when he's repeating many of the things that are written in Exodus or in Numbers or in Leviticus even, he's repeating these things and he's admonishing them. Sort of like when you send your child off to school, you give them a final admonition as they get on that school bus. Be good today, Johnny. Well, that's what Moses was doing. He's saying, now I'm going to remind you about all the law I taught you some years ago when we were at Sinai. And that's the book of Deuteronomy. So at the end of Deuteronomy, this is near the end, in chapter 28, let's read this. Chapter 28, verses 1 and 2. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. It's a pretty amazing blessing, isn't it? All these blessings will come on you and accompany if you obey the Lord your God. Okay? So these promises, they're for people to obey. Deuteronomy 28:15, however, includes the fact, however, if you do not obey the Lord your God and do not carefully follow all his commands and decrees I am giving you today, all these curses will come on you and overtake you. So he had just gone into a section of blessings and curses, saying these are all the good things that are going to happen to you, and these are all the bad things that could happen to you if you choose a different route. And furthermore, he elaborates later on in the chapter in verse 64. Then the Lord will scatter you among all the nations, from one end of the earth to the other. There you worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known. So baked into the Torah, all these commands and all these blessings, there's also the awareness, the knowledge that if they disobey, there are going to be consequences. And so, the role of the prophets is to call the people back to the Torah. In 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 13, it describes this. It says, the Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers, Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets. So he warned them. Turn from their ways, obey the commands and decrees. You see, the role of the prophets is to point people back to the Torah. And then in Amos 3, verse 7, here's an interesting verse. It says, surely the sovereign Lord does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. In fact, we talked about the 17 books we're going to be talking about, and of those, 15 are prophets. The prophetic message was full of warnings and woes, but also hope and redemption. And in fact, the Israelite kings just they were evil from the beginning, all the way through. Now, 8 out of about 20 of the Judean kings were righteous. The Bible says they were righteous. But you still have 12 kings, some that reigned for 50 years, that were downright evil. And so the prophets to both Israel and Judah were full of warnings and woes. But most of the prophets have messages of future hope and redemption. Now, all of those promises, they also come with conditions. So many times you read in the prophets, there's a promise of something good, and you think, oh, well, that's fulfilled right here later on in their history, isn't it? Well, by and large, what you'll find is, no, not quite. So the hope continues, and the hope is laid out yet again. And in fact, the messianic hope of the Jewish people, and this, I'm trying to repeat this as I've learned it from Jewish rabbis I've listened to, is that there's going to be a righteous king. Not like all these unrighteous kings. There's going to be a righteous king, more righteous than any other, who will lead the people with justice and will lead them back to a society of righteousness. And there will be redemption for the nation. And in fact, the nation will be so full of the light of God that there will be redemption and an example for the world. So that is the messianic hope. It's for a righteous king and for a righteous king and for a messianic age. And if you read in Isaiah, it even talks about an era of world peace. So the messianic king and the messianic age are in general the Jewish concept of the messianic hope. So throughout these prophets, every one of these prophets is speaking to the current generation about the current problems and the pending difficulties that will come on them if they don't repent. But then they lay out frequently, many of the prophets lay out a future hope of redemption and renewal and return. So that's the prophetic message. It is in the messages of hope that we sometimes see mention of a future messianic king or a messianic age, a restoration of Judah, a restoration of the people of God. Key geographic features. I'm going to move over here to the map. One of the things you've got to understand is you've got to understand the two bodies of water here, the Sea of Galilee in the north, the Dead Sea in the south, and the River Jordan that flows from the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. And then, of course, this is what we call the Mediterranean Sea, but to them it was the Great Sea. It was the Great Sea. So there's the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and the Great Sea. And then the river Jordan flows from north to south into the Dead Sea. And because there are really no outlets here, the salt continues to collect all the salts, and that's why it's called the Dead Sea, is because nothing lives there. There's some cool prophecies, by the way, about that, about new life being given to the Dead Sea. But anyway, and then we've got Jerusalem and Judah in the south, and Samaria, the capital of Israel, in the north. We've got these nations of Ammon, Moab, and Edom, who were constantly a challenge to the nations of Judah and Israel. There's Philistia over here. The Philistines were seafaring Aegean people that settled over here. And then there's Phoenicia up in the top, and then there's Aram and Damascus. Now, you've heard of Damascus. It's the capital of modern-day Syria. Sometimes Aram is called Syria in the Bible as well. But you shouldn't confuse Syria with Assyria. Assyria was something different. Okay, this is the Assyrian Empire. It's important to know its capital. Its capital is Nineveh. Notice here are the Tigris and Euphrates River. Okay, this area known as Mesopotamia, you may remember that from school. We talked about the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent goes from Mesopotamia all the way down through what was the land of Canaan, what's sometimes called as the Levant. It's the land of the Jordan and Transjordan. We got Judah, Jerusalem, Damascus. Wow, Damascus is actually pretty close to Jerusalem when you look at this big map. But here is Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Damascus is the capital of modern-day Syria. And then down here we have Egypt. Something to be aware of, because we're going to come back to it, is that in the Assyrian Empire, its capital was Nineveh. Haran is another major city that we're going to see was important in the latter stages, the decline of Assyria and its defeat. And then Carchemish is the site of, as the Assyrian Empire fled from the Babylonians, they regrouped at Carchemish, and their defeat at Carchemish was the end of the Assyrian Empire. Note, Babylon is the capital of Babylonia, or the Babylonian Empire. So we're not looking at the Babylonian Empire right here, we're looking at the Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians, sometimes one was part of their empire and sometimes it was the other way around. So this diagram shows the Babylonians being part of the Assyrian Empire and Egypt being part of the Assyrian Empire, but it was not that way all the time. Here's the Babylonian Empire. Okay, it's the same geography, but now Babylon, now the capital is Babylon, and Babylon is taken over. And we're going to talk about how that all happened. The Persian Empire basically came from further east and took over Babylon. And when Babylon fell, they inherited all the lands that was the Babylonian Empire. This is the diagram that I handed out, so you have it in your hands. And it just shows the kings of Israel and where the prophets fit in. I'm going to divide this into 7 periods that I call prophetic periods. To me, they're just easy ways to group the kings and the prophets and what was going on in that era so that it can fit in my brain at any one time. Okay? Different scholars will group things differently. That's okay. But there was what I call the early divided kingdom, which was the kings up here right after the Civil War, when Jeroboam and the 10 northern tribes broke off from Rehoboam, who was the king of Judah, and the tribe of Benjamin in the south. So after the Civil War, that's what I call the early divided kingdom. We're not going to talk about that very much today, nor are we going to talk about what I call the middle divided kingdom, which where two of the most famous prophets in the Bible had their ministry. And you remember King Ahab was a very evil king, and Elijah was the prophet who confronted him. And then Elisha was a very famous prophet who succeeded Elijah. And so they belong to what I call the middle divided kingdom. All right? And then these are the ones where the books of prophecy that we have are situated in what I'm calling the pre-Assyrian period, the Assyrian period, the Babylonian period, the exile period, and the remnant period. One of the reasons why this is an easy way to look at and understand and remember the prophets and what was going on during each of their ministries is that Isaiah, this pre-Assyrian period, is the period of Isaiah. So Isaiah ministered to 4 kings, or prophesied during the reigns of 4 kings. It mentions that in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 1. And I'm calling that the pre-Assyrian period. The Babylonian period I'm calling from the last 5 kings of Judah. And that was the period during which Jeremiah prophesied. So this is the Jeremiah period, if you will. Then we have Ezekiel. Ezekiel didn't spend his time prophesying in the land of Judah. He was in exile. He spent his time prophesying while the Israelites were in exile in Babylon. Here's what I just explained. Elijah, Elisha, and others were active in the early and middle divided kingdoms. In the pre-Assyrian period, Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, more or less in chronological order. In the Assyrian period, Nahum and Zephaniah. In the Babylonian period, Jeremiah, perhaps Joel. The book of Lamentations was written by Jeremiah in that period, and probably the book of Obadiah was in that period. So during the exile, I have Habakkuk, Daniel, and Ezekiel. During the remnant, I have Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then non-prophets, but speaking a lot about life in the whole goings-on in the remnant period is Ezra and Nehemiah. In the early divided kingdom, the one thing I want to point out here is that Jeroboam, when he broke off from the southern kingdom, when he led his rebellion, his civil war, he couldn't have his people going back to Jerusalem for the feasts. He couldn't have that. Otherwise, the integrity of his northern kingdom would be messed up. So he created 2 alternative centers of worship. There was one in the south at Bethel, and there was one in the north at Dan. And there, in Dan and Bethel, Jeroboam set up 2 golden calves, and he said, Israel, here is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Worship here. Don't go to Jerusalem. Worship here in Dan or Bethel, places that are closer to you. This setting up of alternate places of worship and installing idolatry at these alternate places of worship and elevating them to the level of Jerusalem worship is what's referred to repeatedly throughout the Bible as the sin of Jeroboam. Okay, so you'll read that in Kings and Samuel and Kings. Sorry, no, you won't. Not Samuel, because that was United Kingdom. In Kings and in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, probably 2nd Chronicles, you'll read about the sin of Jeroboam. Idol worship didn't begin with Jeroboam. No, but he made the most prominent idols ever in Jewish history, right there in Bethel and Dan. So just be aware that oftentimes references to like the sin of Jeroboam or Bethel and Dan and so forth, they're talking about that. I'm going to move ahead. We've got Elisha and Elijah in the middle divided kingdom, addressing Ahab and his descendants. Another way, by the way, to organize the way that you look at groups of kings is to do it by dynasty. Here in Israel, there were a variety of different dynasties, like the Omri dynasty. Omri was king, and then his son Ahab was king, and then they were descendants or family members on down. Then Jehu comes along, wipes out the family and all the nobles of Omri and Ahab and Joram and so forth, and wipes them out and becomes the new king. So that's a new dynasty. Okay, a dynasty is a succession of kings from a single family. So Jehu had his own dynasty, succession of kings, and they each had their own sins and so forth. So what I tried to do was figure out what collections of kings in Judah matched up with what collections of kings in Israel, and matched up with what groups of prophets, and then try to get a handle on the story about what's going on during that period. And I've included references up here at the top. So you can go and read. If you pull this slide out and you want to study this period, you can read 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings 15, and you'll see all these kings, and I should have put the Chronicles versions too, but you'll read those kings and those prophets and those kings. But let's move on to the books of prophets that I'm more interested in. In the book of Isaiah, he says, the very first verse says that these were oracles given through the prophet Isaiah during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. By the way, I put little pluses next to the kings who were deemed righteous kings in Judah. Understanding this story helps you understand these prophets and what they're speaking to. Now, you have to be aware, Amos and Hosea were prophets in Israel. And in fact, Jonah, Amos, and Hosea were all prophets in and around the Jeroboam II period, which was a reign of 40 years. So if you wanted to read the prophets in order, which I recommend, and I'm about to go through, having done all this study, I'm about to go through and reread all the prophets. I'm going to read them in order, and I'm going to read them in blocks. So I'm going to read the background history, and then I'm going to read Jonah. Now, Jonah was not a prophet to Israel or Judah. Jonah was a prophet to Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. Why? Well, scholars have wondered, why did God send Jonah to Nineveh? And in fact, Jonah wondered himself, why are you sending me to Nineveh, God? Nineveh, this is a terrible people. They're getting very rambunctious, and they're looking to come down and invade us and so forth. Why do you want me to go to Nineveh? He went to Nineveh, he preached in Nineveh, they listened to his words, they repented, and that's what the book of Jonah tells us. And it also tells us, the Bible tells us that Jonah predicted some events that occurred during the reign of Jeroboam II. So I put Jonah first. The scholars disagree a little bit on which order these things came in, but I put Jonah first because he made predictions that Jeroboam fulfilled. And then Amos is generally considered to be the earliest prophet to Israel, and Hosea the longest prophet to Israel. So Hosea was a prophet to Israel from the reign of Jeroboam all the way down through the final king before the destruction of Israel, that is Hosea. So let's talk about the events that ended this period. The events that ended this period were that the Assyrians came down from the north. Remember how everything has to be from the north and the south, because the middle there is just the Arabian desert. So they came down from the north. They wiped out Israel in 722. 722, Assyria conquers Samaria and wipes out the nation of Israel. 20 years later, they come back from Judah. They conquer the entire land of Judah except one little city. You know which city that was? Jerusalem. They laid siege, and that's not a little city, it's the biggest, baddest, best city in the region. And it had a great wall, and it had great defenses, and it had, Hezekiah did a lot of things to protect the city against invasion. Aqueducts and so forth. So there was a lot that went on during Hezekiah's reign to protect the city. But they were surrounded by the Assyrians. The Assyrians lay siege to the city. And it was awful to hear about the hardship, the privation, the deprivation that went on in Jerusalem during the siege. And people wondered, how is this possible? God, how could you let this happen? But one day, they all left. All the armies besieging the city left. And as a result, there is a Jewish people today. If Jerusalem had fallen to the Assyrians, they would have done to the southern kingdom what they did to the northern kingdom, which to completely obliterate the people. And when I say obliterate, what I mean is intermix, intermingle, resettle, all kinds of things. And the Jewish people would be no more. But Jerusalem was preserved by a miraculous set of circumstances. Now, it's interesting that we when I say we, 20th century or 19th century archaeologists, I think it was actually in the 20th century, in the 20th century, Nineveh has actually been found. Ancient Nineveh has been found near Mosul in northern Iraq. And the ruins are extraordinary. They've actually found the throne room of Sennacherib, the king who conquered all of Judah. And oh, by the way, he's got this big fresco on the wall of the conquest of Lachish. And why wouldn't they have the conquest of Jerusalem? It's because it didn't happen. Lachish was the second biggest city, most prosperous city in Judah.
So they besieged Jerusalem, but they didn't.
But they didn't conquer it. So if you go back in your mind, you think of that picture of the Assyrian Empire. It looks like they took all of Judah, all the way down to Egypt. But there's one little dot, Jerusalem, that they never got. So there are prophecies in Isaiah and Micah to Judah about this period, because this was a catastrophic period. And oh, by the way, these events happened during the reign of Hezekiah. How the conquest of Israel was in 722. That was the devastating event in this line of kings. And that's what Amos and Hosea are speaking to. Okay, now we get to the Assyrian period. This is when the Assyrians they've already done their conquering. They're now boss of the land. What's going to happen here? Well, the big debate in Judah, notice now I have a new arc of kings. Hezekiah, his son, Manasseh, who is evil. He was one of the most evil kings, reigned in Jerusalem for 54 years. And he did perhaps because there was this debate. Should we befriend Assyria? Should we cooperate with Assyria? Should we do what Assyria says? Should we make other alliances against Assyria? So even though Jerusalem was never conquered, the king in Jerusalem was beholden to the Assyrian king because he was surrounded. The Assyrians owned all the land all around. So Manasseh did many terrible things with regard to obliterating proper Hebrew worship in Jerusalem and introducing all kinds of idols. All kinds of idols. So this was a big question in the day. Were they going to make an alliance? Were they going to rely on Assyria? Were they going to try to be independent, do a rebellion? In any case, what happened was Hezekiah was a very righteous king. Manasseh and Ammon, his son and grandson, were wicked kings. And Josiah became king when he was 8 years old. About when he was 16 years old, they rediscovered the Bible. So they rediscovered a scroll, a book of the law in the temple that had not been destroyed by Manasseh. And Josiah led a righteous renewal in Israel. But you can imagine if a leader tries to lead a group or a nation in spiritual renewal, it's going to take a while for the people to get there. So some of these prophets are criticizing the fact that the hearts of the people aren't really in it. Now Nahum is he's all about woe to Nineveh. And this is at a period where the Assyrian Empire is strong. It looks like it's never going to fall. And yet he's predicting that it's going to fall. Zephaniah, similarly during the period of the reign of Josiah, is predicting that Assyria is going to pay for its sins. So here are some events that end the period. In 612, Babylon, that is the Empire of Babylon, captured Nineveh. They sacked the city, the capital city of Nineveh, conquered Assyria. But the Assyrian Empire would not go easily. So they retreated. Remember, I pointed out those three cities, Nineveh, Haran, Carchemish. They retreated to Haran. 3 years later, there was another big battle where the Babylonians dealt a second blow to Assyria. And then the Assyrians fled, regrouped in the city of Carchemish. And in 605, in the Battle of Carchemish, the Babylonians came and dealt the final blow to Assyria when they defeated the Assyrians at Carchemish. That was the end of the Assyrian Empire, and they they almost immediately, within a year, Babylon was in control of all the lands that had been under the control of Assyria, including Judah. Now, interestingly, the Assyrians had partnered with Egypt. Okay, Assyria's up here, hunkering down in Carchemish, and they've got all this land, and Egypt is down here. And they said, hey, come help us. Help us against the Babylonians. If you don't help us now, you're going to have the Babylonians breathing down your neck. So the Egyptians were marching an army north to join in the Battle of Carchemish, to actually join in the battle, I think, in Haran. It's not exactly clear to me whether the Egyptian army was coming to defend or partner with the Assyrians in Haran, or whether they were going to defend them at Carchemish. But on the way north through Israel, Josiah said, hey, this Egyptian army is marching through our land. We got to stop them. And so they marched out, and Josiah died. So Josiah's death caused a new sequence of events to go on in Jerusalem. and in Judah, these two battles are the most important to know for prophetic purposes. The Battle of Nineveh and the Battle of Carchemish, because you hear about them being prophesied in Nahum and Zephaniah. Okay? So the Babylonian period, really, this was when Babylon was in charge. And when, you remember how I said in 605, the Babylonians basically instantly got control of all the remaining lands that were under Assyrian control. Well, that meant that they were, within months, they were at the doorstep of Jerusalem. And so we now have a new arc from Josiah. You see how I've got these periods with one overlapping king each time? So the story of the kings from Josiah to Zedekiah, these 5 kings, are the period of the end of Judah, when the Babylonians are ascendant. The Babylonians are ruling in the land, not the Assyrians. And one of the things that's interesting to see here is that there were 3 exiles, right? There wasn't just one exile that happened in 586. In 605, when Nebuchadnezzar took down the Assyrians in Carchemish, within months he was at the doorstep of Jerusalem. He asserted his control, and Daniel and many other noblemen from Jerusalem were deported. So then in 597, there was a rebellion, and Jehoiakim decided that he was going to rebel, and they came back in 597 and put down that rebellion, and there were more people carted off, and there was more damage done. And then in Zedekiah's reign, there was another rebellion, and he was seeking an alliance with Egypt, or considering an alliance with Egypt. And there's talk in the prophets about, don't go down to Egypt. I brought you out of Egypt. Don't go back that way. Don't rely on Egypt. That's the wrong thing to do. But Babylon came and put down that rebellion. And in 586, Jerusalem fell. Now, it was not just a friendly put down. It was a complete destruction. The walls were torn down, burned with fire. The temple was burned. Everything was wiped out. Jerusalem was wiped out. The wall, the temple, the city, and the people, a large number of people went into exile. So there were really 3 exiles, if you will. Now, I think this is generally seen as the big year of exile, 586, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. But that's 605. Daniel gets to Babylon in 605. So Jeremiah is actually prophesying throughout this period. And at the end, after Babylon falls, he writes a lament that is called Lamentations. So Lamentations is not a separate prophetic book. It's just one of the books in our group that we're talking about. It was written by one of the prophets. But Lamentations is essentially lamenting the fall of Jerusalem. Habakkuk is somewhere in this period before the fall of Jerusalem, but he's anticipating the fall of Jerusalem and the danger of the oncoming Babylonians. Obadiah is actually not a prophet to Judah. Obadiah is a prophet speaking to Edom, one of those 3 nations down in the southeast. And it was, again, there's some debate among ancient scholars as well as recent scholars about where Obadiah should be dated. Because there is an Obadiah who was a prophet much earlier, but if you read the content of Obadiah, it doesn't seem like it can be the writing of that earlier prophet. So Generally speaking, people date Obadiah to, generally, there are scholars who think different things, but generally people think Obadiah is a reflection on how Edom helped Babylon in the destruction of Jerusalem, how Edom pounced upon fleeing Jews and took advantage of them as they were fleeing from Jerusalem after the beat down by Babylon. And so Obadiah is a prophecy of woe to Edom. All right, that nation that to the southeast that was no friend to Israel during that time. The book of Joel is really uncertain in terms of where it's to be dated. The book of Joel, I think it's 3 chapters. It's all I forget how many chapters it is, but it's all about a locust swarm. It's about a locust swarm, and it might be that that's what all it's about, and that it should be dated actually much earlier, along with Amos and Jonah and so forth. And that's why it shows up early in the list of the 12 minor prophets. So it might be that, or the locust swarm might be an analogy, a picture of the coming horde of Assyrians, or it might be a picture of the coming horde and destruction of the Babylonians. So we don't quite know. No one really knows. People have their theories. I encourage you to read. Read the history. Read the book. See where you think it fits best. See why you think that people have been debating this for centuries. The exile in Babylon, the leaders in Babylon. Remember we heard about Jehoiakim? Well, his son was Shealtiel, and his grandson was Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel is one of the main characters who's going to be involved in the return. So the return, Zerubbabel is going to lead the first return to Judah. Daniel is not a prophet per se, but he's in that list that we call the prophets. So Daniel and the noblemen were taken to Babylon in 605. Jehoiakim was deposed and exiled. Zedekiah was captured, blinded, and in Babylon where he died. Interestingly, 36 years later or so, Jehoiakim was released from prison and honored and given to eat at the table of the Babylonian king, Evil Merodach. That's a wild name, but that's the name of that Babylonian king. And then in 539, Persia conquers Babylon. Okay, so a lot of, there are very clear prophecies in Daniel about Persia. He even names Persia. So, and here it happens. So Daniel and Ezekiel have a lot of references to these coming events. And then the remnant, the return. Who are the leaders who lead the first return to Judah? Zerubbabel, who is the governor now. Although he's of kingly descent, he is not a king because Persia's not really into them having a king. And Joshua is the high priest. He's the grandson of the last high priest in Jerusalem. So Haggai and Zechariah are very clearly and explicitly during that period. So what happened in 539, Persia conquers Babylon. In 538, there's the decree of Cyrus. All exiled peoples are supposed to return. Zerubbabel leads a group from exile back to Jerusalem. It turns out that they don't get very far with rebuilding the temple. So 20 years later, Haggai and Zechariah show up and say, guys, rebuild the temple. And they get on with it and they do it. So in 520 to 516, the second temple is completed under Darius I. In 458, Ezra returns, and another 10 or 13 years later, Nehemiah returns. Ezra was a priest, and he brought about the reestablishment or the re-energization of the temple worship. He had religious reforms, and he introduced reforms to teach the people so that everyone would know the Torah. And Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king while he was in Babylon, but when he came back to Judah, he was the governor, and he set about rebuilding the walls. So rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the people, and the religious heart for worship, rebuilding the walls. And that's a lot what these three prophets address. And with that, we're done.
Wow.
So I've intended that this presentation would be something that you could refer to when next you decide to read the prophets. And with that, we will adjourn.